So, here's the deal. I've lived in this house for a while now, and my neighbor, well, let's just say she's been a bit of a pain. She's got this big house, a huge driveway that can fit 4 cars, and all this space in front of her place. But for some reason, her kids and their friends kept parking in front of my house. Every single day. I mean, there's plenty of space in front of her own house. In fact, the property across from hers faces the side of her house, so there's ample room for her to park without even touching my street. I get that people park on the street, that's normal, but why right in front of my place when she has so many options? It wasn't like I was asking for much, just some basic respect. At first, I brushed it off, but after a while, it started to get on my nerves. She didn't even give us the courtesy of parking in front of her own house, and here she was, taking the best spots in front of mine. Little did she know, I was starting to take notes. One day, it was just the last straw. I had come home after a long day at work, and once again, the prime spot in front of my house was taken by one of her guests. I was tired, annoyed, and honestly just done with the situation. I tried being polite, but nothing was changing. So, I made a decision. I'm sure you're thinking, oh, come on, don't escalate things. But here's the thing, if I couldn't park in front of my own house, why should she get the privilege of using the space in front of mine? That's when I started parking in front of her house. Not just once, but every single time I needed to park. I'd get home, pull up, and take the spot right in front of her place, without hesitation. I wasn't being rude, I was just doing what she had been doing to me for weeks. Let's call it a little payback for her inconsiderate behavior. At first, it felt petty, but soon it became oddly satisfying. A few days into my new routine, it happened. I was pulling into the spot one evening when I saw her walking down her driveway, clearly not too thrilled. She crossed the street, came up to my car, and knocked on my window. I rolled it down, expecting the usual polite neighborly small talk, but instead, she just stared at me with this cold, angry look. She didn't waste time. "You think this is funny?" she snapped. "You're being mean and vindictive. You're going to ruin the vibe of this neighborhood." I was taken aback at first, but then I realized, this was exactly what she had been doing to me, ruining my vibe. I tried to keep my cool and responded, "I'm not ruining anything. I'm just parking in front of my house, the same way you've been doing in front of mine." She raised an eyebrow, scoffing. "Well, I can park wherever I want. It's legal." I nodded, agreeing with her. Of course, she could park wherever. But the way she said it, like she had the upper hand, irritated me even more. "True," I said, "but so can I." She wasn't happy with that, not one bit. "If you keep doing this," she warned, "I'll call the cops on you." At that moment, I wasn't sure if I should laugh or be genuinely worried. She actually threatened to call the cops over a parking spot. But then I realized it didn't matter what she threatened. I was in the right, and that felt good. The days that followed were strange. I kept parking in front of her house, just like I had been doing. Every time I did, I felt this mix of satisfaction and discomfort. I mean, I knew I was doing it as a form of revenge, but deep down, I wondered if it was worth it. Was I really that petty? Then, I started noticing the little things. Whenever I saw her, she would give me this cold, almost venomous look. Her guests started avoiding eye contact, too. And her kids? They'd act like they didn't see me at all. The silence between us was growing thicker. The tension was palpable. But the funniest thing? I found myself laughing about it more and more. Every time I parked in front of her house, I felt like I was winning a small victory. I had this quiet, almost mischievous satisfaction knowing she was seething just a little bit more each day. It felt like a game, and I had the upper hand. It didn't take long for the first victory to come. One morning, I was out on my front porch drinking coffee when I noticed her coming out of her house, looking around frantically. Her guests were late, and she seemed more than a little agitated. As she walked down the driveway, I could see her eyes darting to the parking spots. When she saw that my car was parked right in front of her house again, she froze for a moment, almost as if she couldn't believe it. I'd parked there a few times before, But this time, something felt different. I could sense that she was frustrated. She was trying to figure out what to do next. I could almost hear her thoughts, he's not backing down. Later that day, I watched from my window as she drove her car around the block, likely looking for a new spot to park her guests. It was petty, sure, but I couldn't deny how good it felt to see her scramble. For the first time in a long while, I had the upper hand. And it felt oddly empowering. Her reaction was priceless. I could see her glaring out of the window as she drove by, like she wanted to shout something at me. But she didn't. She just drove off, and I couldn't help but smile a little. It was the first taste of what felt like sweet, quiet revenge. I was starting to believe this might actually work. From that point on, things started to feel like a full-blown silent war. Every day, I'd park in front of her house, and she'd do everything she could to avoid parking anywhere near me. The vibe between us was icy. There was no more casual hellos or small talk. Just this constant, low-level tension. One day, I happened to be outside when her kids came home from school. They pulled into the driveway, but one of them hesitated before getting out of the car. I could see them looking at my car parked in front of their house, then glancing over at me, sitting on my porch with my coffee. I didn't move, I just stared back. It wasn't that I wanted to make them uncomfortable, but it was hard not to enjoy the small satisfaction of seeing the shift in their behavior. Even the neighbors around us were starting to notice. I overheard one of them talking to another about how weird it had gotten around here. People were starting to take sides, and it was clear that my neighbor was losing the public battle. Sure, she had every right to park wherever she wanted, but in this game of passive-aggressive parking, I had one simple rule: play by the same rules. Each day, her frustration grew. And each day, I felt a little less guilty about my petty revenge. I knew it wasn't ideal, but it felt like the only way to make her understand how much her actions had bothered me. Then, things took a turn. One evening, as I was pulling into my usual spot in front of her house, she came storming out the front door. This time, her face was red with anger, and I could tell she wasn't about to just let it go. She marched up to my car as I was getting out, and without a word, she pointed at me and said, "If you park here again, I will call the cops." Now, I wasn't expecting that. I mean, I knew she was annoyed, but calling the cops over a parking spot? That felt a little extreme. I paused for a moment, letting the ridiculousness of the situation sink in. Then, I calmly replied, "Go ahead. You can call them, I'll do the same." She narrowed her eyes, clearly furious that I wasn't intimidated. "You're just trying to push my buttons, aren't you?" she snapped. I wasn't trying to push buttons, well, maybe a little, but I was genuinely surprised at how far she was willing to go. I gave her a look and said, "I'm just parking in front of my house. I'm not doing anything illegal." She stood there for a second, eyes burning, before she turned and went back inside, muttering under her breath. The whole exchange was strangely satisfying, but also left me with a nagging feeling. Was I going too far with this? Was it really worth pushing her to this point? I didn't have an answer yet, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't backing down. After that confrontation, it felt like things had escalated to a whole new level. She wasn't just angry anymore, she was actively trying to intimidate me. I would see her peeking out her window whenever I parked in front of her house, watching me like a hawk. It was clear she was waiting for me to slip up, to give her a reason to call the cops. But I wasn't going to let that happen. I started parking in front of her house even more regularly, just to make a point. It became this silent standoff between us. The neighborhood had taken notice, and I could tell some of the neighbors were starting to feel uncomfortable with the tension. But honestly, I didn't care. This was my space too, and I wasn't going to back down because of her petty power play. One afternoon, I had just pulled into my spot when I saw her standing on her porch, staring at me. I looked back at her, not saying a word. She didn't move, just glared. It was like a weird, unspoken challenge hanging in the air. Neither of us said anything, but I could feel the weight of it. She was mad, no, furious, but there was also a sense of resignation in her posture. Like she was realizing I wasn't going to back off. Not now. I had the distinct feeling that she was starting to regret messing with me. And for the first time, I felt like I was finally in control of the situation. It was a strange sense of power, one that came from standing my ground, even if it was over something as small as a parking spot. But sometimes, it's the small victories that matter the most. Things started to change after that standoff. For a few days, there was this unspoken calm between us. I kept parking in front of her house, and she kept glaring at me from behind her blinds. No more threats, no more confrontations. It was as if we had both silently agreed that the battle had reached its peak, and now we were just riding out the tension. One afternoon, a few weeks after that standoff, I was on my way home from work when I noticed something different. Her guests had parked on the opposite side of the street, no longer in front of my house. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then it hit me: she wasn't parking in front of my house anymore. None of her guests were. I couldn't help but feel a little smug about it. I had won. Not through a big, dramatic showdown, but by simply holding my ground. Her frustration had finally boiled over, and instead of continuing the fight, she had backed off. For the first time in a while, I could park in front of my own house without seeing her car parked there. I didn't feel bad about it. In fact, I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. She had tried to dominate the situation, but I had quietly asserted my right to the same space, and she had been forced to give in. It felt good. A little petty, but good. And every time I saw her looking out the window at me as I parked, I could see it in her eyes, a mixture of anger and defeat. It wasn't the loud, in-your-face victory I had imagined, but it was still a win. As the weeks passed, the situation started to settle into an uneasy silence. My neighbor didn't confront me again, and I didn't provoke her either. It was like a weird détente had formed between us. The parking situation was no longer an issue. I would pull up in front of my house without a second thought, and her guests stopped parking there altogether. But the aftermath wasn't as peaceful as I had hoped. I couldn't ignore the strange tension that lingered every time I saw her. There were no more angry words, no more glaring at each other, but there was something in the air, a kind of coldness that made every interaction feel awkward. It was like we were both walking on eggshells, unsure of what to say or do. One day, I bumped into her while walking to the mailbox. She was out gardening, and I had to admit, the effort she put into her yard made it look nice. I didn't know how to act. The silent war was over, but the uncomfortable vibe was still there. I tried to make small talk. "Nice weather, huh?" She barely looked up, but then nodded. "Yeah. It's been warm." It felt like we were just two strangers passing through the same space. But that's when I realized something: the whole situation had drained me. The petty parking battles, the anger, the silent standoff, it had all taken more out of me than I was willing to admit. And for what? A parking spot? I didn't want to keep playing these games anymore. So, I made a decision that I hadn't considered before. I stopped parking in front of her house. Not because I was afraid of her calling the cops or because I'd lost. But because I realized that it wasn't worth holding on to that grudge. It was a small victory, but it didn't bring me any real peace. For the first time in a while, I didn't care where I parked. It wasn't long before I realized something important: I wasn't angry anymore. The constant tension had faded, and with it, my need to win had disappeared. In a way, the parking war had been a distraction. A way to channel all the frustrations I had been carrying around into something petty and small. But now, I was left with the question: why had I even cared so much? It hit me that the whole situation had never really been about parking. Sure, on the surface, it looked like a battle for space in front of my house. But really, it had been about feeling disrespected. It had been about my neighbor's disregard for the boundaries we shared. It had been about me wanting to stand up for myself. But what I hadn't realized was that the longer I held on to the anger, the more I was allowing her behavior to control my emotions. I had spent weeks holding on to that resentment, and it wasn't until I let go that I realized how much lighter I felt. I didn't need to continue this petty war to prove a point. I had made my statement without even needing to say a word. I wasn't going to let her push me around. But now, I realized it wasn't even about proving anything. It was about finding peace again. I watched as she came home from work one day and parked in front of her own house, just as I was doing now. There was no longer any tension in the air. The game was over, and we were both living our lives again, quietly. And honestly, I felt better for it. Maybe it was a small victory, but it was mine. And sometimes, that's all that matters. Looking back on everything that had happened, I learned a few important lessons. First, I realized how easy it is to get caught up in petty conflicts. A parking spot became something much bigger than it needed to be, all because of a simple need to feel respected. The truth is, we all need respect in different ways, and sometimes it can be hard to find a healthy way to assert it. But the real lesson? Holding on to resentment and anger only made me feel worse. By letting go and letting the situation resolve itself, I found peace, not just with my neighbor, but within myself. If you're ever in a situation like this, where you feel slighted and need to prove something, my advice is simple: don't let it consume you. It's easy to get caught up in small victories, but they're not what bring real happiness. Sometimes, the best victory is just walking away, finding peace, and moving on. You might not get the dramatic, in-your-face win you imagined, but you'll get something far better: the ability to live your life without that unnecessary weight of anger. Trust me, it's worth it. A few weeks after I'd let go of the parking standoff, something unexpected happened. I was sitting on my porch, enjoying a rare moment of quiet, when I noticed my neighbor walking over to my yard. She was holding something in her hand, and as she got closer, I saw that it was a small plant in a pot. My first instinct was to brace myself. Was she going to start another confrontation? Maybe she was going to accuse me of something else, or who knows, maybe just drop another passive-aggressive comment. But instead, she stopped at the edge of my yard, hesitated for a moment, and then spoke up. "Hey, I know things got tense between us. And I'm sorry for how I acted," she said, her voice surprisingly soft. "I've been thinking about it, and honestly, I wasn't handling things well. So, I thought I'd bring this over, just a little peace offering." I was completely taken aback. The last time we'd spoken, she had stormed off in anger, threatening to call the cops. Now, here she was, offering an olive branch in the form of a plant. I didn't know how to respond at first. I wasn't expecting an apology or any sort of peace gesture from her. After a long moment of silence, I finally said, "I appreciate that. Really. I know we've had our differences, but this means a lot." She smiled, a little sheepish. I figured it was time to stop holding on to all that nonsense. Life's too short for this stuff, right? I nodded. "Yeah, you're right." We stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, and for the first time in ages, the awkwardness between us seemed to lift. I accepted the plant, and she lingered for a second before turning to leave. As she walked back to her house, I couldn't help but think that this little moment was bigger than any of the petty fights we'd had before. It wasn't just about parking spaces anymore. It was about two people realizing they'd wasted time and energy on something that wasn't worth it. And in that simple exchange, there was more healing than I had ever expected. In the days that followed, the dynamic between us continued to shift. It wasn't an immediate change, but there was an undeniable shift in how we interacted. The tense silence gave way to polite nods when we passed each other. A few times, I'd catch her smiling at me from her porch or wave as I pulled into my driveway, and I'd return the gesture. We never became best friends, but something far more valuable happened: we both found a way to coexist without the constant undercurrent of resentment. It wasn't perfect, but it was a step in the right direction. The parking situation was no longer an issue, and honestly, it felt like the weight of the conflict had been lifted from both of us. The plant she gave me became a symbol of that change. It wasn't just a gesture to make up for past mistakes, it was a reminder that people can evolve, even in the smallest ways. We all have our faults, but that doesn't mean we have to hold on to them forever. Looking back, I realized how much this little parking war had taught me. It wasn't just about standing my ground or proving a point, it was about the emotional toll that small, unresolved conflicts can take. I spent so much time and energy holding onto that anger, thinking I was winning when really, I was just draining myself. The real victory came when I let go of that bitterness. The moment I stopped trying to win was the moment I found peace. And in the end, that's the most important lesson I could take away from this experience. So, if you're dealing with a situation that feels petty or unimportant, remember this: sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight within ourselves. Letting go of old grudges and finding a way to move forward can be the most freeing decision you make. And, who knows? Maybe even your neighbor will come knocking with a peace offering one day.